called maybe something else, I don't know. They are now called Thrive because, this series is about thriving in business today. So we have a variety of topics for everybody. Thank you so much for taking time to join us. We're really excited about today's topic about when the internet was being born. Thank you, Dan, for that wonderful title.
It's a great image.
Yeah, right. Yeah. And then we've also got some other upcoming events as well. You'll see some of those listed on your chairs. Make sure you guys kind of know what's going on. If you're internal, you'll see a lot of things on Chatter. If you're external, you'll see a lot of things on social. We invite the community in all the time, and for all the internal teams that are here, thank you for being here as well. Tomorrow night is the Open Boulder here at Zayo as well. So Dan will be there, and also Brad Feld. I think you guys might know Brad as well. We'll be here tomorrow night, so join us also for that. We're looking forward to that. And then another upcoming one is the Inclusion and Innovation Summit. That's going to be at E-Town, and we're very, very excited about that. All Zayo employees are invited. All managers will be there, so please come join us. It will also be live cast. So if you can't be there physically, you're in a different office, you're in a different country, they'll be able to join that way. And another one is the next Thrive series will probably be maybe June, and that's going to be entrepreneurship and the things that entrepreneurship can help solve. And so we also got Boulder Startup Week is coming, so let's make sure we're out there. Zayo's going to be all over Boulder Startup Week. There's a lot of things to get involved in, to be curious about. If you have questions, see Allie Patterson. If you don't know Allie Patterson, I'm sure we can help connect you with her. And we also have the Cowan Infrastructure Summit. The first ever Infrastructure Summit is going to be here in Boulder this summer in August. And follow us in social, of course. Where's Cece? Where's Sierra? Is she not even here? Sierra does all our social. Yes, go social. So connect with us out there. We're pretty responsive. And last but not least, I think then is to introduce our guests. So first.
Wait, can you introduce who you are first? No.
Oh, I'm so sorry. So hello, I'm Rachel Donaldson. I run people, culture, and brand here at Zayo, working directly with Dan and the executive team. And I think I know a lot of people in the room, but you're right, I don't know everybody, so I apologize for that. Thanks, Dan. Okay, Ryan.
Yes.
I will try to do you justice. I have this amazing bio here. So Ryan is the co-founder of the Foundry Group. And prior to co-founding Foundry Group, Ryan started his career in venture capital at Mobius Venture Capital in January of 2000. Doesn't time go so fast?
Indeed it does.
While at Mobius Venture Capital, Ryan led the firm's investment in Postini, very cool, Sling Media, and prior to joining Mobius Venture Capital, he also co-founded Excite in 1993. That's pretty major. Which went public in 96 and later became Excite at Home following the $6.7 billion merger of Excite and At Home in 99. At the time, this acquisition was the largest internet transaction to date. Wow. And created a company that achieved peak revenues of $616 million in 2000. And there, Ryan held the role of principal engineer and was a key technological contributor to the company's search engine and content management systems, and also led the design and implementation of Excite's community and commerce platforms. Ryan was also responsible for integrating engineering teams and technologies into Excite's infrastructure following the acquisitions of several companies based in Seattle and Austin. Prior to Excite, Ryan was a member of the technical staff for the Hewlett-Packard division at Oracle Corp, where he worked on several releases of the Oracle Office platform. And before joining Oracle, Ryan was a software engineer at Canon Research of America, where he focused on the development of optical character recognition algorithms. I also do that. For sure, no. He is passionate about helping entrepreneurs build great companies that can move markets, and is fortunate to have worked with startups and from the dudes in the garage stage to the public company stage. And we thank you very much for coming in here today to join us.
Well, thank you. I'm going to remember to cut my bio down by a couple hundred words next time. That was,
And I have to read it because there's so many amazing things. I don't leave anything out. All right, and then also we have Jack. Jack Waters is here joining us on our Thrive panel today with Dan. And Jack Waters is the Chief Technology Officer for Level 3 Communications, focused on global network technology, architecture, engineering, process, and security that are critical for Level 3 to deliver the solutions its customers need. Mr. Waters joined Level 3 in 1997 and has held numerous roles with the company spanning operations and engineering. Prior to his current role, I'm just going to call you Jack. It's a little weird to keep saying Mr. Waters.
I know.
All right. Jack led Level 3's global operations team. Before joining Level 3, Jack served as an executive staff member for MCI Communications with responsibility for network architecture, design, and implementation. In that role, he was also an original member of the team responsible for Internet MCI, the company's initial internet service. Prior to MCI, Mr. Waters, Jack, worked as Director of Engineering Operations. Is it Suranet?
It is.
Okay, for Suranet, the Southeastern University Research and Academic Network. Jack, thank you for being here and welcome to the panel. Dan,
Thank
I'll let
you.
take it from here.
Thank you. And thank you, Jack and Ryan, for being here as our guests and sharing with us a topic that you two have both seen, but seen and experienced from very different circumstances. Jack coming from the East Coast and focusing more on the infrastructure of the internet, but back before it was even commercialized. Ryan from the West Coast and focusing on that next layer 2 up, kind of the initial kind of called software infrastructure, internet search engines, and the other things that we take as for granted today. Now, we got together beforehand, this group, and it turns out they don't even know where the internet came from. They think it's already existed. In fact, half of them don't even know how the internet works. So I guess my first question is, where did the internet come from?
You know that answer better than me.
Yeah, by the way, I mean, I know so many people here. I used to be the young guy. Now I feel like the old guy. So, but the way I would say it, where it started is actually back in the 50s. And if you go back in time as when the Russians put a man in space and Sputnik and all that happened, the U.S. government responded, Eisenhower, believe it or not, responded with starting something called ARPA, the Advanced Research Project Agency. And from there were a number of investments in basic technology, lots of work at Lincoln Labs, at MIT, a guy named Leonard Kleinrock, I think was his name, and another guy, Paul Barron, who wrote the seminal paper on packet switching. So if you really want to go back as far back, even before I was born, 1964 is probably the year in which you'd say, hey, all this great stuff kind of started with some really good ideas. From there, call it 69 or so, was that the Summer of Love?
Switching.
Yeah, and that's actually when BBN got the contract to build the first packet switch, what was called an interface message processor, and went on to build. It was built out of a little Honeywell mini computer, and that was the beginning of the ARPANET, and the ARPANET thrived for 10, 12 years. Into the early 80s, and from there the National Science Foundation kind of picked up the ball and built a network between major research institutes in the U.S. and kind of from there it all evolved. So that would be my answer.
Yep. I know you read the book. At least I think you did on the innovation.
Isaacson's
Innovator's
book, and
how much of that was new to you, Ryan, versus stuff that helped you piece together your early internet experiences?
So a lot of it was sort of rehashing stuff I'd read in other books or other articles. Being a sort of student of technology history and trying to understand where the internet came from. That was something both that came up in when I was at Stanford as an undergrad, because it was kind of in our backyard to some degree, but certainly when you think back to those the IMPs and whatnot, right? These are it's like take up a whole rack of equipment and it's probably sending data at
50 kilobits.
Yeah, 56 kilobits, right? So that early stage as BBN happened, and what were some of the other companies that were sort of core early commercialization? Yeah, UUNet. That was exactly. And I remember actually, so when I was in college, so this is '89 to '93. The internet wasn't quite the full kind of contiguous network of networks that it is. Like when you had to actually think about sometimes which network somebody's email address was on, and you had to address it in a different way so that it would get kind of routed.
Bitnet, CICnet, there were a bunch of different.
And so I mean I remember that from my early days as a student, and most of that got kind of ironed out. Certainly by the time I was a senior, like you didn't have to worry about one of the addressing schemes was in addition to sort of the common @ something .com or whatever .edu in the case back then. I remember there was like a percentage sign that did something. I mean, it was just, again, this is all, it's crazy that was something you had to think about. But
well, UUNet started as prior to it being a network. It was a does anybody know what UUCP is? The Unix to Unix copy program. That's the way UUNet actually started. It was a mail relay. It was a message board relay, and from there.
I don't think you know what UUNet is.
Yeah, UUNet was a network that it was the first. Actually, your company bought it, right? And it was the first real money acquisition in telecom for internet services, and I think it was $2 billion that was paid in, I think, 1996. MFS Telecom, Dan's former company, bought UUNet as really one of the first major transactions in the early internet days.
So when you think about the early commercialization of the internet, what experiences can you guys recall that are like personal to yourselves, where it started to dawn on you that the commercialization of this thing called the internet was going to be a big deal? Was there any seminal moments where that began to come together?
Well, I'll say early days of Excite, we almost backed into it somewhat unintentionally. I mean, and then there was many moments along the way where we sort of realized or continued to realize the magnitude of the thing we had sort of stumbled into. When we started Excite, it was myself and 5 of my classmates from school. It was to build a search engine, but as enterprise software, right? So it was not. The web was very nascent, and so what we were building was we had this sort of even more basic observation that was sort of orthogonal to the internet, was that, okay, enterprises in the country, corporate America, were having this sort of explosion of not just structured data like you might have in an Oracle database or something, but there was increasingly the, sort of unstructured text data, right? Documents, word processing programs, et cetera, and that there wasn't a good way to search those, and that the world needed a search engine that was easy to use. There was a handful of companies around at the time, including Verity and Fulcrum and these other companies that built search engines that basically enterprises would deploy, on the equivalent of what you'd call their intranet now, or really on their LANs, right? Searching file servers full of documents, and they were. The companies that existed before Excite, we were actually called Architects Software early on. The companies that existed before Excite, were doing sort of traditional enterprise sales and selling, 6-7 figure contracts. But the total market for search engine technology, probably when we started Excite, was $100 million a year or something, right? And it had nothing to do with media or advertising or any of the kind of stuff that we wound up sort of stumbling into at Excite. And the reason we got there was very kind of circuitous, but we were Unix hackers. We bought old Sun workstations from the Stanford surplus, and that's how we started building our code. And our sort of insight was all of the other search engines used all this crazy query languages, Boolean operators, and you had to sort of almost be a programmer yourself, even
computer
to run a
scientist,
search.
yeah.
And we said, hey, wouldn't it be great if you could just put in a few words and sort of get back relevant documents, even if they didn't necessarily contain all the words in your search and that kind of thing. And so we started building what's called a vector-based search engine, which is just a bunch of math that allows you to sort of find related documents without having to be so precise. And when we started showing it to people, it was on a Unix command line. So imagine trying to demo somebody you're trying to sell software to, who's an executive at a company, saying, well, here's how it works, right? Imagine there's all these documents, and you type a bunch of arcane commands, and everybody's eyes would glaze over. And so, whoops, sorry about that. So what happened is we said, okay, we need to put a user interface in front of this. And none of us were GUI programmers. We didn't really program Mac or Windows at the time. And so we said, well, how are we going to do this? We're Unix guys. And it was right about that time, so this is kind of 93, 94, that there was this thing called Mosaic, right, that was coming out of Urbana-Champaign. And
My alma mater.
yeah, exactly. And sort of where, and of course that's the project that made Mark Andreessen and Netscape famous. And we said, oh, well, here's this thing that'll allow us to put a graphic user interface in front of our code and not require us to learn how to program Mac or Windows. And so we did that, and almost inadvertently, as we were demoing to people, became known as guys who had an internet search engine because it was running through this browser. And we needed to find documents to demonstrate that that we could search a big corpus of documents, and that was actually hard to do back then. We had like CD-ROMs full of medical journal abstracts and things like that, and we said, well, we need to get more data, and there was this thing called the web, right, that was just growing right around then, and so we wrote what's called a spider, which is still what Google uses to this day, which is basically a bot that goes out and crawls the web and finds the websites and finds the links on those pages and then goes visits those links and just keeps going continuously. And so we built that, and we actually had an honest debate at the time. There was this old protocol that was also a way to get information from different servers on the internet called Gopher.
Waze, yeah.
Yeah, and Waze, and so we almost decided to build a Gopher search engine, right, as opposed to a web search engine. And basically we said, well, it looks like the web thing has a little bit more data there, and it is certainly growing a lot faster, so let's try that. And that's how we sort of inadvertently became known as an early internet search engine. Just as we were showing it to people, it's like, oh wow, you could use this to find things on this new internet. And the only other way to do it at the time was with Yahoo, which was the guys who started Yahoo, Jerry and David, were sort of at Stanford around the same time as us. They were grad students, we were undergrads, and they built this sort of directory by hand that you had to kind of click around. And we were like, well, that's too hard and ultimately unscalable. And that's how we wound up building a search engine. But it was very much there was no sort of path of realizing, oh, this will be a gold mine because we're going to build a search engine that on this little sort of weird corner of the internet, the web, that's going to somehow lead to greatness.
Mine was a little different, and probably I'm doing the math here, about 4 or 5 years earlier, and I started working as a summer student, as an intern. So if anybody's an intern, you'll hopefully have a similar experience at some point. And I just started working at a government site that just so happened to be one of the first sites on the internet. And I sort of young engineer, kind of interested in technology at that point, and realized things like email. Wow, you could really talk to a lot of people. I mean, it sounds silly now, but back then, you could draw the number of sites on the internet on one piece of paper in 1985. So imagine that, the number of actual sites on the internet all on one piece of paper. And kind of as I started working, the first couple of years, everything was doubling. Every metric that you could possibly look at, number of sites, traffic, connected nodes, all of those things was doubling every 3-4
yeah.
months.
Yeah.
And so slow guy over here thinking, well, wow, this could be pretty big. And I got involved with the education part of the NSFNet, which is what you were asking, SuraNet, the Southeastern University Research Association Network. And it was basically a network that went from Maryland to Louisiana to Florida and connected all the universities. And so I was there and realized it was right around 1993 was when the privatization, which I would argue is probably one of the seminal events of the internet, where the government said, all right, we're going to stop funding this thing because it looks like the commercial world is going to start to take over. And I was over at this little research institute and bumped into some folks over at MCI, and they said, we'd really like to build a network and an internet backbone. And so myself, and I don't know if Rob's here, but Rob Hagens, who some of you may know, Rob and I worked together at MCI. And the really cool thing is that I was part of the NSFNet privatization group that wrote a proposal that companies would respond to. It just so happened that right at the end of writing that proposal, I left MCI and won the actual bid for the privatization. So we were lucky enough to win all what was essentially 60% of the internet's traffic overnight in MCI, and that's how Internet MCI kind of started. And then for me, you know, I always wanted to build something, and I'd always taken over someone's network. I had never actually been in part of construction or actually, and it became really obvious that there's a point not too far in the future that all this voice traffic and everything else is going to be surpassed by internet traffic. And I remember bumping in, it's hard not to, I think most people know Dan was my first boss at Level 3. And thinking, you know, the first week we did a small little calculation at Level 3 and said, what is the arbitrage opportunity between voice traffic and data traffic? And it was about 90% of the revenue was associated with the voice network, but only accounted for less than 10% of bits. And it seemed pretty obvious at that point that everything was going to flip the other way. It seems silly. It's almost 20 years ago now that you hear that. But the math was so apparent that, oh my gosh, you know, everything, communications could easily be carried over internet technology in the not too distant future. And I'll tell you, that was probably one of the hardest things to get somebody that had been in telecom for a few years to accept, because all the revenue, I mean, hundreds of billions of dollars of revenue were over on this voice thing, and yet, you know, we were out hucking the fact that, hey, IP technology is going to take over everything.
Yeah, and I mean, it's a classic kind of disruption story, right? Because a lot of the old school telcos, you know, waited, and you know, were caught flat-footed. I mean, I think to me,
it's kind of telling. You know, I was noticing when we were looking at our bios, you know, both of our companies that we point to as our seminal events no longer exist.
Yep. Yeah, and that's a whole story unto itself. I mean, I think one of the interesting things about the birth of the internet really is, you know, to me, it's one of the best examples of like smart public policy that you could possibly think of, like the privatization of the internet.
Maybe the only example.
And, well, yeah, no, absolutely, right. Where it's, you know, there was something in the water, you know, even back to sort of the post-World War II era, Eisenhower, whatnot, where there were, I don't know, we lucked out with this sort of enlightened view of government-funded research and whatnot, and, you know, led to all these amazing things, including the internet. But then also, the government had the good sense to get out of the way when it was time to privatize it, right? And you know, it had sort of developed a critical mass, and it was time to, you know, sort of push the bird from the nest or whatever. And you know, it would have been so easy and so likely in many other circumstances for that to have not happened, right? Or for them to have, you know, botched it in, you know, from a policy perspective. And so it's actually pretty amazing that you know, it's an ideal scenario, like you said, and maybe the only one.
So when you think about those years of the internet, so call it the 90s, early to mid 90s, those who were part of the internet had certain belief systems, certain values that were different than what I would say traditional values are, whether traditional technology or business organization philosophies, things that they're almost religious about. You know, you guys were almost religious about. What are those? What do you remember those principles to be, those values to be that permeated the world of the early internet pioneers?
The one that jumps to mind and is around, you know, in the kind of mid 90s, you could have easily just said to a competitor, "Hey, I don't want to connect to you." And you know, you see all these huge battles right now at the FCC and the EU and around the open internet order, net neutrality, call it whatever you want. And I look back then and say, you know, I remember calling up people at competitors and saying, you know, it's really just in our best interest to connect to each other, and we should continue to do that. And and we'll do it for free. We'll trade the economics. I'll buy a connection, then you can buy one, and then you buy one, and literally, phone calls are probably not the greatest thing. If you're a lawyer, you probably hate all this, but it really was that sort of spirit of, hey, we're kind of in this together, and we're a part of something that is probably at that point pretty obvious was going to be pretty big. Yet we had all these very informal business relationships, and I think that sort of got to a fundamental belief that together is better than separate, and you hear peace, love the internet is probably a little bit like that.
Yeah, well, I think, and there's a couple layers on which that was true, obviously down at the infrastructure layer, but then there was also a very sort of, political sort of internet activist part of things, early on as the web was growing, right, really around this philosophy of, information wants to be free, and, this is this universal publishing mechanism that's going to, it's a new media type, and all the rules are different, and to some degree that was true, to some degree it wasn't. I mean, I think that there was actually people, when Excite got started, when we started selling ads online, that actually caused sort of a great deal of friction, right? And folks thinking, okay, you've somehow violated the sanctity of the internet or web, right? By selling ads, right? And we launched Excite.com in October of '95. Before that, we were again sort of behaving as almost an internet or enterprise software company. And we launched Excite.com, and it was really sort of with this notion of, Yahoo was growing quite quickly. We launched our search engine. We had 1.5 million web pages in our index, right? Which, again, is sort of an interesting contrast because, Google's probably got 15 billion at a minimum now, if not 50 billion or 100 billion. When we started selling ads, the sort of internet purists, who believed that this should be sort of completely hands-off from a commercial perspective, we're somewhat upset about that. But at the same time, we were sitting around the table, and one of the best examples to me of thinking big, and something that I learned a lot from, was Vinod Khosla, who was the founder of Sun Microsystems, was on our board and was one of the Series A investors in Excite. By the way, to put that in context, right, the first investment from Vinod was $250,000, along with Jeff Yang from IVP, now Redpoint, was the other $250,000, and then it was, see what you guys can do with that $500K in the first year, and then we'll give you another $2.5 million, right? And so we launched Excite on $5 million of funding total and whatnot. Sold 60% of the company for that $5 million. So very different era. It wasn't at the time like everyone who was out in the Bay Area or went to Stanford thought that they were going to create a startup or go raise venture capital. I mean, I didn't even know what venture capital was until we started Excite. And Vinod, early on, as we were launching Excite, said, this is a new medium. You guys are a new media company. Being a search engine is going to be one of the most important functions, right? This is all very prescient, and we're talking about this in 1995, that there is, and like all media types, we'll have an opportunity to sell advertising, but you guys, Excite, can be the next NBC or CBS, right? And this is when we're still 20 people working out of a garage in Palo Alto and a living room in Cupertino, and just about to move into our new office space, and just to have kind of that, it was like it was an object lesson in how to be audacious or not constrain your thinking, right? And to say, oh, this little tiny thing, because it's growing so fast, is going to be the next major media type property.
So $500,000, like 250. We had a very similar experience with Level 3. We only had $3 billion to start that up.
Right.
And like 15 people. I would say that those ordeals, those ideals, weren't always right. If you're in the music industry, and you look what happened to the music industry because of the internet, it wasn't, if you were in the old media, it was not a great outcome.
Right.
And it very much challenged, copyright law, and things like Napster got turned off because of that, and Nicholas Zenstrom couldn't fly into the U.S. for about 10 years because of it, and there's lots of interesting things that those ideals actually challenged. Law, policy, industry, all of those things. And who would have thought iTunes would be pretty much the one and only, I guess you could argue Pandora and a few others, but
right.
one and only outlet for a whole medium.
Yeah, and I think that to me though was such a case of, and there was all these, again, all this sort of information wants to be free, idealists, call them techno anarchists or whatever you want to call, back then, who thought, Napster's totally fine. Everyone should be able to steal music or whatever. And I'm a musician. I very very much believe that it is theft, and it posed a real threat to the business models of the major labels. The major labels, though, I think fumbled a massive opportunity because they sort of took the let's attack this thing and try to kill it approach, as opposed to trying to embrace it and figuring out a way to monetize Napster. If they had, if they had this site, right, and which for the time in the internet was amazing, right? Napster, obviously not a site, but a peer-to-peer network, had something like 70 million users on it, which was the majority of the internet users in North America. And instead of saying, hey, we have an audience of 70 million music fans, let's make it easy for them to pay to acquire this music. No, let's try to stomp them out. And so and they fought that for years, and then let Steve Jobs walk in with his iTunes store and iPod, and effectively by giving people look, it's preventing piracy to some degree is all about just providing a low friction opportunity to keep honest people honest, right? I mean, most people are willing to say, "Oh, I'm going to go pay for this," but they basically, the labels just wanted to shut down that entire. They were just so afraid of it, and it did represent a grave threat. But I think they totally bungled.
Absolutely.
The way they,
Absolutely.
way they handled it. They could be in much better shape had they sort of embraced, look at this. This is a new medium. It has almost no friction, right? Like we can get rid of shipping CDs around and letting them sort of collect dust at retail stores, right? And it's instead they basically sued their own customers.
So if you staying again in a similar era, the early mid '90s, think of contemporaries of yours that you met back then, perhaps they really impressed you back then, and then what they've done with their careers and how you've seen them blossom. What individuals come to mind when you think of someone who was kind of maybe a collaborator, maybe an inspiration to you back then, or maybe just someone you interfaced with here and there and said, boy, that person's going to do something over the next 10, 20 years, and what names come to mind?
Mine clearly first is Dan Caruso, because he's so much older than I am.
I said contemporary.
It's a great question. There were a few folks that were instrumental at that time for me. I worked with Vint Cerf, who arguably is the guy that invented IP. I worked with him for him for a number of years, and although his career was well on his way, I've never met anybody that thought as big and as broad as he. And it leaves an incredible mark on yourselves. My belief is the guy should win the Nobel Prize for what is honestly one of the greatest inventions of the 20th century. I think we always run into the few folks that we met along the way. We met the guys at Skype before Skype had launched, and it was clear that they were onto something really, really early on, and we're gonna do pretty well, and that certainly turned out to be the case.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly sort of being in that first round of kind of internet, software media type companies, ran into tons of people, and certainly the alumni network of Excite itself. Had people have gone on to do all sorts of interesting things. Interestingly, a lot have wound up kind of in venture over time. A guy by the name of David Z, who was he came in. He was probably in the first 30, 40 employees at the company, maybe even in the first couple dozen. He's now partner at Greylock, venture investor. He left Excite right around 2000 and joined Greylock. Greylock was very much an East Coast firm with kind of a West Coast satellite office at the time, and he came there to lead their sort of consumer internet investing practice. And then in April 2000, when the Nasdaq peaked and then crashed, I remember having these conversations with him. He's sort of like, I think I might have just made a bad move, because what I'm ostensibly supposed to be investing in now is terribly out of favor, and the companies were failing in this sort of the post-internet bubble. But David wound up being early investor in LinkedIn, in Facebook, Pandora, right? I mean,
So it's worked out.
Yeah, so it's worked out really, really well. Because he was a year or two ahead of me. Graduated a couple years earlier at Stanford, but was in my major. Stanford has this thing called symbolic systems, which is what my degree is in, which is a sort of multidisciplinary degree that's combination of computer science, computational linguistics, mind-body philosophy. I mean, it attracted this very sort of interesting group of people, and it was relatively small. There's maybe 30 to 40 graduates any given year. But one of the guys I met during that, and sort of on a couple panels, sort of shortly after we got out of school, and the Excite thing happened and whatnot, is Reid Hoffman. Who's also obviously well known as Facebook board member, founder of LinkedIn, et cetera. And again, that sort of symbolic systems set of people who I met as an undergrad. Marissa Mayer, CEO of Yahoo, was also a symbolic systems major. So there's just a bunch of interesting folks there. I met.
I think it's also really the folks that I've bumped into are ones that had like a pretty interesting idea. And the idea being something that's pretty fundamental. And we when I was at MCI, a guy that worked with us was a guy named Dennis Ferguson, and if you've never heard of him, he's actually the founder of Juniper, and he had a really interesting idea around how to build an algorithm for searching for forwarding tables. And it's very technical, deep into hardware and hard math, and a super, super smart guy. And he went on to do really well, but it was the most technical of technical ideas that you could ever imagine at a time when that's 96, 97. So right when Cisco was killing it, there was never going to be another router company. I remember hearing that at the time. There would never be anybody that could overtake somebody like a Cisco. And here these guys went, and Vinod was one of the investors at the time, and they went off and with this one kernel of an idea went and created what is frankly the number two, and they've done pretty well.
Great. I'm going to open this up to questions from the audience. Does anyone have one handy? If not, I'll come up with something. There you go. And if you can make sure you maybe stand up, introduce yourself to everyone, and talk pretty loudly.
I'm Jeff Sweeney. I work here at Zayo. One of the really cool things about the internet is that it's scaled really well from what was essentially kind of designed to connect universities to something that connects everyone. I think everyone here has a connection in their pocket right now. Do you see any limitations on this as it gets bigger and bigger, or is it something that's just going to keep scaling?
You want me to?
Yeah,
I'll go from an
the
infrastructure
right
perspective. There's some obvious ones. There's some obvious scaling issues. IPv4 address space is only so big. There's 6 or 7 billion that you can actually allocate, of which 5 or 5.5 have already been, and we aren't handing out addresses anymore. So eventually we'll have to switch, the whole infrastructure will have to switch to IPv6, plenty of addresses in that space. So that's one. But honestly, you
That'll
could
get done.
It'll be an event. I mean, there will be a time where we have to do something, and we're, I think everyone is still ignoring it a little bit personally. But that day is coming, and the great news is it's solvable. There's technology that's out there. I remember, go back to my memory of, many years ago, probably 15, 20 years ago, every day I would worry about, oh my gosh, how are we going to build a network to support the traffic for next quarter? And every quarter it was just, we were inventing things. We, were inventing ways to connect boxes together, and we would go and try to get companies funded to go and build scale. The interesting thing is now I don't really see any scaling issue when it comes to volume of traffic, speed of traffic. There's so much great technology on the shelf right now, and if you get into for those that are optics folks, you'll remember we were all worried about nonlinear effects in fiber and all kinds of crazy stuff, and then this thing shows up as coherent detection, and suddenly we're not worried about any of that anymore, and all the fiber that's been put in the ground is actually pretty usable. I don't see from a volume perspective or a scale perspective, other than addressing too much of, I think we'll be able to continue to scale. And thanks to companies like Zayo, Level 3, and a few others, not many others, there's a lot of fiber in the ground.
Yeah, and I think it is sort of the ability of the infrastructure, as you were saying. I mean, literally, companies were being funded, technologies were being invented to handle the scale, whether it's faster routers or DWDM, faster computers, all these kind of things. But it's a testament to how the sort of the tech ecosystem works, right? Because whether it was Juniper or another Vinode deal, Cirrent, and other things, right? Where he and his probably best string of successes were in that sort of late '90s, early 2000, where he made the investments several years before, but recognized that I'm going to invest in basically optical telecom equipment, because that's the only way to get sort of sufficient bandwidth, and made a number of big bets that all turned into kind of multi-billion-dollar outcomes. But this notion that there was a sort of a scaling bottleneck, but sort of the way the industry works, and venture capital and whatnot, is people wouldn't know that these problems were coming, go out and raise a bunch of money and build the hardware to deal with the scaling. And it feels like we are, maybe with the exception of, I think wireless is maybe a little more challenging over time, but that's because it also bumps into regulatory issues and spectrum allocation and things like that. So that's maybe a little bit more constrained than wired or fiber type bandwidth growth, right? Which effectively kind of feels infinite at this point, right? I know that's.
I always worry about the infinite.
Yeah.
But how many people have heard of Moore's Law? Right? Moore's Law, everything doubles, every 18 months. And for decades, Intel would really struggle with saying how they would meet Moore's Law just for the next 3 or 4 years, 5 years maybe. And now if you went and asked the Intel guys, they would say, we have a path to meet Moore's Law for the next 15, 20 years right now. So it's a pretty interesting time from a technology perspective.
Well, and I remember very much when I was an undergrad, so think of it 92, 93, and I was taking some electrical engineering courses, and one of the professors there did a lot of sort of VLSI, very large scale integration, sort of, it's kind of an old term, I guess, for chip making. But he was very concerned that they didn't see a path to kind of get chip feature sizes smaller than 100 nanometers, right? And we're the current generation of we're like 14 nanometers right now, things that are shipping mass on I think the Intel's newest line of processors that have 14 nanometers. And there was actually a very I remember, again, mid-90s, the transition to the first 90 nanometer process. I think Intel was 2 years late, and they had, maybe it wasn't 2 years, maybe it was a year, but they had built their brand new multi-billion-dollar fab and just weren't getting the yields out. Like, they really got kind of stuck on physics and material science, and yet they've now blown through that. And again, everyone's worried about what happens when we get below sort of 10 nanometers into the single-digit nanometers, because at some point the physics of silicon does.
You're down to the atoms.
Yeah, you're down to sort of single atom feature sizes, and weird quantum things happen when it's that small, and we'll have to figure out another set of materials to make that work.
And a whole different computer science for the first time,
Yeah.
maybe ever,
Yeah.
is quantum computing. As you guys look forward into, go ahead, please. No, please.
Hi, I'm Nicole Casanova. What are the two things that 20 years from now we'll look back at this room and say, why didn't we think of that? Or like, is it IoT? Is it white space? What are the next two things that are coming? 20 years from now, we'll think that was on the horizon we didn't realize.
Do we have to say two?
Yes. So I'll give you two. Maybe
You know, I'm not a big buzzword fan and latest trend. You can go read about on the web. You can't help but to hear about cloud or SDN NFV or any of that stuff. But the Internet of Things notion, I think, is real, and I think every estimate undershoots where we're going to end up. If you look at just the 2020, I think it's Cisco or one of them has said 50 billion devices. I think that's low.
Yeah.
I really think that it's not too hard to get to. If you're building a house today, or in your existing house, it's easier if you're building a house. Everything that has electricity could have an IP address, a light switch, a light bulb, a refrigerator, a toaster. I mean, and you may say, well, what does it need it for? There's actually lots of pretty interesting things that come from a very highly instrumented home. And you say, all right, well, if it's just today, if you count in your house, maybe you have 10, 15 devices that have an IP address, you easily get to the hundreds. Easily get to the hundreds of things connected with IP addresses. So I look at that and say, man, I think we're undershooting the impact of what that Internet of Things really means.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely agree with that, and I think we're probably undershooting it by orders of magnitude. I mean, 20 years is kind of, to me, a time horizon that is almost nonsensical to try to predict, given sort of what technology innovation curves look like. I mean, it was 7 years ago that the first iPhone came out, right?
Yeah.
And no one was expecting that. Mark Andreessen, was famously quoted as saying, when Apple introduced the iPhone, it was like they had, it was delivered through a wormhole from 5 years in the future or something, right? because nobody was expecting it, and it opened up, obviously, broke the carrier's control over the software stack, and a bunch of things that had massive impacts that it would be hard to predict, and that's not even like a science fiction development, of like, oh, we're going to have transporters or something, or be sort of hacking our DNA, and all of those things I think are quite possible. And when you go out 20 years, you kind of get to this area of it's really the kind of predictions you could make will sound almost science fiction-like, because we're just on this sort of pace of accelerating change, and so
Yeah, if
gosh,
you just look back 20 years,
Yeah.
I mean, that was just at the very beginning of the commercialization of the internet, and think about all the things that have happened just in those 20 years.
Yeah, and I think, again, I mean, to me, though, the IoT is really kind of the next, because it's instrumenting the world, and it's instrumenting ourselves, right? I mean, my Fitbit's sort of IoT to some degree, and there's going to be more and more of that, right? I'm, a very happy recent acquirer of the Tesla, right? I mean, it's amazing, and it's basically a computer on wheels, right? And not to mention sort of all the implications of the battery-powered electric technology behind it. And I think, I think, and I hope, right, that we'll see big changes in terms of the electrical grid, things like that. Even though, and those are changes that probably will take 20 years to make, because that infrastructure turns over very, very slowly. But hopefully, we're in a much better state with respect to energy, clean energy, et cetera, as time goes on.
I have a bold prediction. There will be a company, a great company, a sterling company, whose name is Level Z. Anyone here read the book? It's a book out right now called The Future of the Mind. Anyone? If you want to know what the future is going to look like, read The Future of the Mind. And the author of it's a very well-known and well-respected theoretical physicist, but he's gone a little bit out of his space. He's one of the experts in string theory, but The Future of the Mind does a great job in talking about kind of what is going to be evolving. He's careful not to give exact points in time, but talks a lot about stuff that will be, commonplace 5, 10 years from now, 20, 30 years from now, 70, 80 years from now, and it's just crazy.
Yeah, I mean, I think the other thing to talk about is probably AI, and it's obviously portrayed recently, mostly in kind of a negative light, right? And it is a scary. There's sort of many paths along which that could be frightening or scary. I mean, Ray Kurzweil's, a great sort of futurist who's done an awesome job of sort of plotting the, exponential growth of technology and our power to process information, et cetera. And, he's actually been remarkably good at sort of predicting when certain things have happened over time. And, I think he puts it at like...
Or perfectly vague.
Or perfectly vague, yes. And there's plenty of very valid arguments against, Ray's kind of wild-eyed futurism, but at the same time, there have been these massive advances recently in neural nets and deep learning and things like that, where look, my undergrad degree, the focus was on artificial intelligence, and I came away thinking it's never going to happen. Was sort of my conclusion. I came away somewhat disillusioned, but that was sort of based on the state of the art in the 90s. When you let Moore's law crank forward another several times, and we get to 10,000 times the computing power we have today, or a million times. That you start to get to a realm where at least the complexity of the system could potentially support, some very, very incredible, very intelligent things that software and computers are able to do. And it doesn't mean they're sort of autonomous sentient beings, but I think we'll see, all sorts of amazing things come out of that.
It's actually one. If I had one piece of advice to give somebody much younger than I'd say it's really hard to think in exponents.
Mm-hmm.
Really, really hard, and you can convince yourself so many times along the way, especially in technology, I'm going to hit a wall, I'm going to hit a barrier, there's no way these sorts of numbers could make sense. And I would tell you that almost universal. It's hard to get the timing right. We've lived a bit of a career at times of not getting the timing right, but ultimately, that thinking in exponents actually has turned out to be the case, and so it's a lesson I remind myself a lot, because you cannot just imagine how it actually turns out. To the point of, hey, AI never made sense in the late 80s, early 90s because of processing, but then you get to where we are with processing today, and it's easy to see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think and again, that point of, humans aren't good at thinking in exponents, right? It's sort of successive doublings, or, moving up by powers of 10, and, early on in any sort of exponential curve, that actually kind of feels and looks
like a
linear,
line,
right? And then it goes like this, and our brains just aren't set up to do that. But my favorite sort of fable, and I think it's retold in the Isaacson book, The Innovators, right, is the fable of the guy who invented chess, right? And so the chessboard's 8x8, and he brought it to the king, and the king was pleased, and loved the game of chess and thought it was amazing. And he said, you can ask me for anything, and I'll give it to you. And the creator of chess said, okay, well, I want you to put one grain of wheat on the first square, and then on the second square I want you to put 2, and the third square I want you to put 4, and sort of keep doubling. And so the king starts having this done, and by the time he's at like the 32nd square, all the wheat in the kingdom is gone. And if you go all the way to the 64th and you've doubled 64 times, it's like all the wheat that was ever grown in the history of humanity, right? I mean, it's just this notion of, here's something very visual, 8x8 squares. If you double something 64 times, it gets sort of cosmically massive in a way that our brains just don't think about. Yet that's what's happening with technology, and so you turn the crank year after year, and it gets pretty exciting.
So I'm going to go back to one of Jack's kind of comments when he says if I was a few years younger, we'll call it that, maybe the age of about half the people in this room, people who are more in the earlier stages of their career, in the 20 to 30-year-old range, 20 to 35-year-old. When you look back at that period of time when you guys were in the 90s and all this stuff was happening, there's a lot happening now as well, both in the industry, broadly defined, and within Boulder. What would you share with the people out here? How should they seize the moment that they're in to do and make the most out of what they have in front of them?
I mean, for me, it's a very clear answer. Early in my career, I fell in love with something. It kind of sounds funny to say, and that was the internet. I was just enamored.
Did you meet your wife at the time?
Well, yeah, her too. No, I love my wife. all of you who will see her at some point in the near future. No, I just developed an incredible passion very early in my career around the internet and around what I thought it could be. I didn't get it all right, but man, having that passion makes it really easy to get up and come run into work every day, and really easy to stay late, and really easy to use every minute of your discretionary time to learn more and more about whatever your passion is. And I tell my kids this all the time. You gotta. There's no point in time when you have to have it figured out, but finding something that you're truly passionate in. And for me, it was in my late 20s, really where I became very passionate around the internet.
Yeah, I think I totally echo that sentiment. Right, when my co-founders and I started Excite, right, it wasn't out of some belief that we're going to follow this well-trod path of go raise venture capital, start a company, raise venture capital, make money in an IPO, right? I mean, that was the furthest thing from our minds, right? I mean, I didn't even know venture capital existed until we stumbled upon it, and it was really about, we were doing something that we were passionate about, right? The six of us were very interested from a sort of academic perspective in the intersection of computation and language, and that's, we started a company backwards to some degree, which is we didn't really have any idea what the sort of commercial possibilities were early on for building something, for building a search engine, but it was something that we were scratching our own itch. It was something that was just fascinating to us, and and I'd sort of add all the other things of I continue to believe that sort of being really even if you're going to be on sort of the product side or sales side or marketing side, and you're not kind of a hardcore engineer techie, immerse yourself in that stuff, though, because it's really important to understand, right? It's really important to know, and in your 20s and 30s, the other thing I would say is, I remember my parents thought I was crazy, right? I got this great job right out of Stanford at Oracle, making $39,000 a year, which was like a lot at the time, right? And
it's still a lot.
Yeah, exactly. And but this is you have kids coming out of Stanford now with a bachelor's degree in computer science, commanding six-figure salaries, right? And so it's it was very different world back then. And I was moonlighting the whole time, getting Architects/Excite off the ground. And then, a year into my time at Oracle, I quit because we were ready to sort of our now or never moment of, okay, we really have to devote ourselves full time to, to building this company. And, the other thing to remember about your 20s, if you're fortunate enough to still be in your 20s or 30s, right, is the cost of failure is way lower for you early in your career, right? You can afford to take the risks, right? I mean, if you don't have the mortgage and the wife and kids and whatnot, right? And one of my co-founders, Ben Lutch, liked to say, we were sort of unencumbered by reality, right? Like that we didn't have any idea what we were getting ourselves into, right? And it was crazy and intense and a roller coaster ride. And had we known sort of how hard it would be, we might have been daunted and not done it. But we were sort of blessed with sort of a combination of sort of ignorance of sort of what it meant that we were going to be working on this company 100-hour weeks for 7 years or whatever, but wouldn't have changed it for the world. And it's also again when I told my dad who was in the Air Force for 23 years and I always had the same job, that I was leaving this well-paying job at Oracle to go full time on this, he was like, okay, son, like sort of very skeptical, very skeptical of that. What are you doing? But I was 21. Like, what did I really have to lose if it didn't work out? Right? I'd go find something else, or I'd go back to Oracle.
It's good to take a bet. I feel the same way. I love to say this because I thought I had a job for life at MCI. Probably not, if you look back from where they are right now. But joined up with a few folks that I did not know. I didn't know Jim. I didn't know Kevin. I didn't know Dan. I didn't know Matt. I didn't know lots of folks around that I went to work with, and it was a huge bet. I had a 1-year-old and a 3-year-old, and had a mortgage, and picked up my whole family and moved to Colorado. So every once in a while, it's okay to take a bet.
It's one last topic or question, and I want you to think about the Front Range of Boulder itself, the Front Range, the entrepreneurship theme that we have going on here, the special role we play in, in our cases in the infrastructure internet, and in your cases in software that revolves around kind of building upon the internet up to including many applications and other infrastructure layers in between. Talk about the specialness of the Front Range and why entrepreneurship plays such an important role in propelling us forward.
So, it's, I think about this a lot, and I've reflected on it a lot because, Boulder and sort of the greater Front Range area really is a pretty special place. I mean, I spent, 17 years living in Silicon Valley, and, to some degree, Silicon Valley will always be always is, a strong word, right? But, it's got a critical mass and a flywheel effect, and it's, it's going to be the epicenter of a lot of innovation. But I think one of the things that has changed dramatically, over the last 20 years is that DNA of innovation has really spread kind of through the globe and across the country, right? And whether it's sort of the high propensity of foreign-born entrepreneurs to start companies in Silicon Valley, and then go back to India or China and sort of bring the parts of the ecosystem there. Certainly, my partner Brad writes a lot about sort of his Boulder thesis and what it takes to create a startup community. But this is such a special place coming from the Bay Area, which, again, I would have that sort of the Bay Area. At the same time, Silicon Valley has its own sort of form of provincialism because it kind of believes that it's the center of the universe and doesn't think too much about what's happening outside of it. And it turns out there's a ton of stuff happening outside of it. And so when I came out here, I was I had one. This was 8 years ago. Had one concern of how is this going to work? Kind of investing across the country from Boulder, but just being so excited to see both the sort of the technical depth of everyone here, which you can kind of trace back to early telecom days, storage days, whatnot, that have been part of the ecosystem here. Obviously, all the national labs and the strength in aerospace and biotech and whatnot, and just obviously how well educated the population is and how entrepreneurial. And one of the things I like about Boulder that I think is special is also that the entrepreneurial ecosystem isn't just sort of a economic monoculture of all tech all the time, right? There's entrepreneurship in natural foods products, in green products, things like that, and so that's been that's really nice to be around because it sort of adds some depth and breadth to the kind of thinking that's going on. And I think I think the other thing that's really special to me about Boulder and the Front Range is there's a kind of a fundamental collaborative nature or bent to how people in the entrepreneurial ecosystem here work that's, I think, much more sort of welcoming and open than you might see, in the valley where everyone's, just sort of screaming to have, to sort of break through the noise. Whereas here, I love it when people, move, having done it myself, right, who move from the valley here or from, New York, right. It's like welcome them with, open arms, saying, don't move in here too fast. But it's like the ecosystem is, really strong and really exciting.
The thing that, and it's funny, nobody is, how many people are from Colorado? Yeah, so less than half the room, which I think is part of the allure of starting a company here. I almost feel silly talking about entrepreneurship. I've been at the same company for 18 years, almost 18 years. So I guess I was back then. But I think two things. One is the valley can only get so big, and frankly, I think the valley is starting to feel the effects of the valley, and therefore there is a huge need in the U.S. for another valley, and I see no reason why it shouldn't be the Front Range. The interesting thing to me is that having grown up most of my adult life here now. It's such a welcoming community, whether it's business or personal, and I think a lot of it stems from the fact that no one's from here. It really is a very destination place, if you will, which is great. And I think for those that haven't heard our story, we hired Anderson.
I can't remember what the song was.
I think it was Arthur Anderson, and interviewed outgoing seniors in college. And asked two questions: where would you most like to move, and where would you hate the least? And turns out Denver wins. Denver Boulder wins on both questions, and it's pretty telling. And
it's why Level 3 chose this area.
I mean, when we started, we didn't know where we were going to move. We were hoping it wasn't going to be Omaha, so that we had that going for us. But very much so that I think it's been a great decision, and it's great to see other companies just continuing to come in. Now, maybe Google down the street, both of us might not like directly, at least at the beginning, but I think in general that's just good for our community in the long run, and will be good for startups, will be good for our companies. I just think this is a great place. I'm never leaving.
Great. Well, we have a couple gifts for our guests, so let me hand them the gifts. And as I do so, think about the last part of the answer to the last question was how this community helps one another out. And we've got two people here who took time out of their busy days to come share their experiences with us and help us out. So thank you very much, Ryan. Thank you very much, Jack.
You.
We appreciate all of you coming here and hopefully picking up a little bit of inspiration and a little bit of history along the way. And thank you again for being part of this.
Pleasure.
Thank you, guys.
Thank you all.